If BC's forestry system was actually working, forestry workers wouldn't be losing their jobs while forests are still being logged. That contradiction tells you almost everything you need to know. Because what we're watching right now isn't a labor problem, and it's not an environmentalist problem. It's a system problem. And when a system keeps cutting trees but can't keep people employed, something is fundamentally wrong. BC has just released another major forestry report, the final report of the Provincial Forestry Advisory Council. It admits the system is broken and everyone is unhappy. It talks about instability, conflict, and failure. But it avoids the one thing that would actually change outcomes: changing the law. Let me say this clearly up front. The PFAC report is not useless because it's ignorant or because the people involved are malicious. It's useless because it was structurally incapable of recommending what is actually required. In plain language, this is what the report does. It proposes changes to how decisions are made: different planning, better data, better coordination, while leaving intact the laws and power structures that determine what decisions are allowed and who controls them. Or put another way, it asks the existing forestry system to behave better, pretty please, without changing the rules that force it to behave badly. PFAC was created under the NDP Green Cooperation Agreement. It was resourced and supported by the Ministry of Forests. It cost public money. And it was billed as a serious attempt to deal with instability in BC forestry. So we should take it seriously. And that's exactly why we need to evaluate it honestly. Because if a report admits the system is broken, but can't recommend fixing it, that's not reform, it's containment. To be fair, the PFAC report does not sugarcoat the problem. It admits that BC's forestry laws were designed for a time of abundant, cheap fiber, not ecological limits, not climate instability, and not long-term community resilience. It admits the following: the system is driven by timber supply targets rather than ecological reality. Governance is fragmented, centralized, and siloed. No one trusts government to be a neutral broker of forest information, and that review after review has diagnosed problems without fixing them. This is not a gentle critique, it's a structural indictment. And that makes what comes next even more important, because knowing the problem and fixing the problem are not the same thing. PFAC's main proposed shift is this. Instead of starting with the question, how much wood can we cut? The report says planning should start with the land itself and what's there. That sounds significant, and on paper, it is. But here's the key question. Do these changes actually force different outcomes, or do they just rearrange how decisions are discussed? Here's what they propose. Area-based forest management units, where regional planning happens first, and allowable cut is calculated afterward. Independent, publicly trusted forest inventory, including LiDAR-based ecosystem data, housed inside of ministries. An arm's length transition and oversight body, because they don't trust ministries to implement reform consistently across election cycles. Folding BC timber sales into regional frameworks and separating timber pricing from forest management objectives. In plain terms, this means BC timber sales will no longer be used to push a certain amount of logging every year. Instead, a timber would only be sold after land use decisions are made, and the price of timber would be set by auction, not by how much wood the government wants taken off the land. All of these are not trivial ideas, but they are also not decisive, because none of them change the rules that determine what outcomes are legally allowed. I attended the PFAC briefing this week presented by Gary Merkel, the council chair, and what stood out was not urgency, it was caution. Again and again, the framing was about political fickleness, about how governments can't focus, how bureaucracies take years to adapt, and how hard decisions create enemies. Collaboration was repeatedly presented as the solution, bringing everyone to the table, aligning interests, and trusting that shared planning would bring better outcomes. At one point, Gary Merkel stated plainly, "We are not thinking we need to change laws." That line matters, because if you're not willing to change the law, then everything else is optional. The overall direction wasn't, "We must act now." It was, "We must not push so hard that this gets rejected." And that tells you a lot. Review after review has been ignored in BC because governments rarely say out loud what actually needs to be done. If people inside government aren't willing to say that existing forestry laws are the problem and must be replaced, then nothing changes. The system simply absorbs the report and carries on. Several people in the room made the same point in different ways. You could implement every recommendation in this report and still not improve forest stewardship or job security in any meaningful way. Here's the core contradiction that runs through the entire report. PFAC argues that politics is too fickle to rely on, and then it designs a system that relies entirely on political goodwill to function. There are no hard legal stops in this report, no binding ecological limits, no codified priorities, no outcomes that survive a cabinet shuffle or a budget cycle. Everything it proposes can be ignored, delayed, defunded, or reversed. Frameworks and recommendations don't bind anyone. Laws do. And that brings us to the real question: who actually controls the system right now? Control does not come from who sits on advisory councils. It comes from who controls access, volume, timelines, and exit. A small number of large tenure holders control most harvesting rights in this province. Those rights are protected by law. The system is legally obligated to maintain a flow of fiber. AAC, timber supply reviews, and volume expectations are built into the legal structure. Capital is mobile. Companies can close mills, move investment, and wait out policy changes. Workers and communities cannot. So when conditions shift ecologically or economically, workers absorb the shock first. That is not accidental, it's structural. Let's talk about why area-based management alone doesn't fix this. And this is where the discussion often goes off track. Switching from volume-based to area-based management does not automatically change who controls decisions or create different outcomes. If the same tenure holders retain access, capital, and exit power, then control does not move, even if the planning map changes. In fact, area-based management can benefit large tenure holders by reducing uncertainty, stabilizing investment expectations, and lowering conflict. We already have a real-world example of this on Vancouver Island. Land under the Private Managed Forest Land Act, or PMFLA, is area-based. And yet those landscapes are heavily logged, biodiversity is degraded, and communities have no say. And that's not because the land is privately owned. It's because the law allows it. Even on private land, forestry is governed by specific rules about what can and cannot be done. Under the PMFLA, those rules prioritize timber production, not ecological limits or community outcomes. The people managing that land still make their money by taking more volume, so the incentive remains to cut as much as the law allows. Area-based management doesn't change that if the law itself rewards or allows volume. Area-based control without outcome-based law benefits landholders or tenure holders, not forests or workers. Forestry workers don't need another layer of planning and oversight. They need employment security grounded in reality. Right now, they're dealing with mill closures, contracting insecurity, long commutes, and communities slowly hollowing out, even while logging continues. That tells you something crucial. Stability for investment, which is what Merkel emphasized, is one of this report's key goals. And that's not the same thing as stability for workers. A stable system that continues liquidating forests still produces unstable jobs. PFAC stabilizes process and administration. It does not stabilize livelihoods. And that leads directly to one of the most dangerous assumptions in the entire report. And that is, if you stabilize the system for investors, if you make capital feel secure, that stability will eventually trickle down into jobs on the ground. That sounds reasonable, but it doesn't work in forestry. Capital and workers experience stability in completely different ways. When capital is stabilized, companies get options. They can slow down, consolidate, shut mills, move investment, or leave altogether. Workers don't get options. They get the risk. When markets shift or fiber runs out, capital can adapt. Workers lose jobs, even while logging continues somewhere else. And that's exactly what we've seen in BC for decades. Investment has been protected, logging has continued, and workers have still lost jobs. So the idea that pleasing capital will protect workers confuses investor confidence with job security. They're not the same thing. A system designed to keep capital comfortable will always sacrifice workers first, because workers can't exit the system the way investors can. Here is the absence that matters most. The PFAC report explicitly avoids recommending replacement of existing forestry laws. That was not an oversight, it was a strategy. Hard recommendations were avoided because they might be rejected. Acceptance was prioritized over adequacy. But bureaucracy does not move on insight. It moves on permission. And permission comes from law. Until an expert body says plainly, these laws must be replaced, nothing downstream changes. This is where the new Forest Act proposal is categorically different. It does not make recommendations, it installs priorities in law. First, ecological integrity is enshrined in law. Primary forests are removed from logging, not deferred or targeted, but protected. Second, community-based decision-making is enshrined in law. Not advisory roles, not just pilots, not simply collaboration or consensus building. In the new Forest Act, decision-making authority is legally assigned to the people and communities who live with the consequences, not left to voluntary cooperation. Third, community-based economies are a legal priority. Restoration, stewardship, second growth forestry done slower, better, and longer. The PFAC report asks the system to behave better. The new Forest Act replaces the rules that enable bad behavior. We've seen this pattern for decades: review, diagnosis, process recommendations, avoidance, repeat. Even PFAC references the Groundhog Day effect.
Stop it!
You cannot get different outcomes from the same laws, no matter how many reports you write. This isn't about good people or bad people. It's about the fact that forests don't respond to recommendations and workers don't survive on intentions. If BC wants real stability for forests, workers, and communities, the rules have to change. That's what the new Forest Act does. And that's why this matters. Independent analysis like this doesn't get funded by government or industry, and that's exactly why it matters. If this video helped clarify what's really going on in BC forestry, I'm asking you to support this work if you can. The link to donate is below, and sharing this video helps too. Thanks for sticking with a serious conversation.